How did my son's baptism turn into an attempted murder investigation in 30 minutes? The holy water in the baptismal font looked perfectly clear when Father Michael poured it over Daniel's tiny forehead, but the communion wine I'd sipped 3 minutes earlier was already making my stomach cramp in ways that felt fundamentally wrong. I stood at the front of St. Augustine's Cathedral holding my 6-month-old son, while my sister-in-law Monica stood beside me as godmother, and I felt sweat starting to bead on my upper lip despite the church's air conditioning running at full blast. The taste of the wine lingered bitter and chemical on my tongue, nothing like the sweet sacramental wine I'd had at countless masses before. I tried to focus on Father Michael's blessing words and Daniel's confused little face as water dripped down his cheeks, but my vision was starting to blur at the edges and my arms felt heavy holding my baby. Monica reached over and took Daniel from me with this concerned expression, asking quietly if I was okay. I nodded because what else could I do in the middle of my son's baptism with 75 family members and friends watching from the pews behind us? The cramping in my stomach intensified into sharp stabbing pains that made me double over slightly, and I grabbed the edge of the baptismal font to steady myself. Father Michael paused mid-prayer and asked if I needed to sit down, but Monica cut in quickly saying I'd been up all night with the baby and was probably just exhausted and dehydrated. She put her hand on my lower back with what looked like support but felt like pressure, keeping me upright and in place when my legs wanted to buckle. The church started spinning and I could feel my heart racing irregularly in my chest, beating too fast and then skipping beats entirely in a pattern that terrified me. I tried to tell Father Michael something was wrong, really wrong, but Monica squeezed my arm hard enough to hurt and whispered that I needed to hold it together for just 10 more minutes. Her breath smelled like mint and coffee and her fingers dug into my bicep with surprising strength for someone who claimed to do yoga twice a week for relaxation. I looked at Daniel in her arms and felt this overwhelming panic that something terrible was happening and I couldn't protect him because I couldn't even stand up straight anymore. Father Michael continued with the ceremony, and I heard myself responding to the ritual questions in this voice that didn't sound like mine, slurred and slow like I'd been drinking for hours instead of taking one sip of communion wine. My mouth felt numb and my tongue was thick and uncooperative, and when I tried to reach for Daniel, my hands wouldn't work properly. Monica shifted away from me slightly, holding my baby just out of reach, and told Father Michael we should finish quickly because I clearly needed to rest. The priest nodded sympathetically and rushed through the final blessings while I stood there swaying on my feet, barely able to process what was happening. My husband Kyle was in the second pew because church tradition kept fathers separate during baptisms, and I could see him starting to stand up with this worried expression. But Monica turned and gave him this reassuring smile and wave that said everything was fine, just a tired new mother having a moment. Kyle hesitated and then sat back down, trusting his sister's assessment over his own instincts, and I wanted to scream at him that nothing was fine and I was dying right there at the altar. The ceremony ended and people started clapping politely, and Monica guided me toward the side door that led to the church offices instead of back down the main aisle toward the congregation. She told Father Michael I needed to lie down in the parish hall for a few minutes, and he nodded and said he'd send my husband back once he'd greeted the guests. Monica walked me through the door and down a narrow hallway, still carrying Daniel, and I realized with mounting horror that we were moving away from everyone, away from help. I tried to pull away from her, but my body wasn't responding to my commands anymore, my legs just following her lead while my brain screamed at me to stop, to fight, to do something. She opened a door to a small storage room filled with folding chairs and old hymnals and Christmas decorations stacked against the walls, and she guided me to sit on a metal chair that was cold even through my dress. Monica laid Daniel in a portable bassinet that was already set up in the corner, which struck me as odd because why would there be a bassinet ready in a storage room unless someone had planned for this? I asked her what she was doing in this garbled voice that came out wrong, and Monica smiled at me with this expression I'd never seen on her face before, cold and satisfied, and nothing like the warm sister-in-law who'd helped me plan this baptism for 3 months. She said I'd ruined everything by getting pregnant when she and her husband Glenn had been trying for 5 years with no success, that watching me carry Daniel had been torture while her body kept failing her month after month. She explained that she'd volunteered to be godmother specifically so she could have this opportunity, so she could take what should have been hers and finally have the baby she deserved. I tried to stand up, but my legs gave out completely and I collapsed back onto the chair, my head lolling to the side as the room spun violently. Monica watched me with clinical interest and said the combination of drugs she'd put in the communion wine should have me unconscious within minutes, and once I was out, she'd tell everyone I'd had a seizure and take Daniel to the hospital herself. By the time anyone figured out what happened, she'd be long gone with my son. The absolute terror of understanding that my sister-in-law had drugged me to kidnap my baby cut through the fog in my brain for just a moment, and I tried to scream but only a weak moan came out. Monica crouched down in front of me and said I'd always been weak and undeserving, that I'd gotten pregnant accidentally while she'd done everything right and still couldn't conceive. She told me about the months she'd spent researching drugs that would incapacitate me without killing me because she didn't want murder charges, just wanted a clean disappearance with Daniel where people would assume I'd abandoned him due to postpartum depression. She'd planned every detail, including having her car packed with baby supplies and a new identity for both of them, hotel reservations in 3 different states under false names. Monica reached over and smoothed Daniel's hair while he slept peacefully in the bassinet, completely unaware his godmother was about to steal him from his mother. She said he'd have a better life with her anyway, that I was too young and unprepared at 23 while she was 31 and financially stable with a husband who desperately wanted children. My vision went completely dark for a few seconds, and when it came back, Monica was standing by the door with Daniel in her arms, his diaper bag over her shoulder, and his favorite blanket tucked around him. She told me goodbye in this final tone, like she was leaving forever, and I heard the door close and lock from the outside. I tried to get up, tried to move, tried to do anything, but my body was completely unresponsive now, slumped in that metal chair with my head hanging forward and drool sliding down my chin. The room was silent except for my irregular breathing and the distant sound of organ music from the main church where people were probably mingling and congratulating each other. Nobody knew I was locked in this storage room losing consciousness while my sister-in-law kidnapped my baby during his own baptism. The drugs pulled me deeper into darkness and I felt myself slipping away, thinking about how Daniel wouldn't remember me and would grow up calling Monica Mom. My last conscious thought was hoping Kyle would figure it out in time, that someone would notice something wrong before Monica got too far away. I don't know how long I was unconscious, but I woke up to Kyle shaking me and shouting my name with this panicked edge in his voice I'd never heard before. Father Michael was there too, and my mother, and someone was calling 911 while someone else checked my pulse. Kyle kept asking where Daniel was, and I tried to tell him Monica took him, but the words wouldn't form properly and everything came out garbled. My mother was crying and saying something about Monica leaving through the side door 20 minutes ago, saying she was taking Daniel out to the car because he was fussy. Kyle's face went white and he pulled out his phone, calling his sister while telling Father Michael to lock all the church doors. Monica didn't answer, and Kyle tried again and again, his hands shaking so badly he almost dropped the phone. He looked at me with these wild, terrified eyes and asked what happened, and I managed to force out the word drugged. Father Michael immediately told someone to call the police, that this was an emergency, and suddenly the small storage room was full of people and voices and confusion. The paramedics arrived within minutes and started checking my vitals while asking rapid-fire questions I could barely answer. They found my pulse dangerously slow and my blood pressure dropping, and one of them said my pupils were severely constricted, consistent with sedative overdose. They started an IV and loaded me onto a stretcher, and I heard Kyle telling the police that his sister had my baby and wasn't answering her phone and had been alone with me right before I collapsed. An officer asked if Monica had seemed strange or upset, and Kyle said no, she'd seemed normal, helpful even, taking care of me when I got sick. But my mother cut in and said Monica had been acting odd all morning, too cheerful and too attentive, hovering around me constantly. The officer wrote everything down and then radioed for an Amber Alert while asking for Monica's vehicle information and last known direction. Kyle rattled off the details with this hollow voice, realizing his own sister had done this, and I saw the moment his brain caught up to the reality of the situation. They wheeled me out through the church's main hall where the baptism guests were still gathered, now standing in confused clusters as police officers took statements. I saw my aunt sobbing and my father looking shell-shocked, and several friends staring at the stretcher with these horrified expressions. The paramedics loaded me into the ambulance and Kyle climbed in with me, holding my hand so tightly it hurt, and he kept apologizing over and over. He said he should have known something was wrong when I started slurring my words, should have come up to the altar immediately instead of trusting Monica's reassurance. I tried to tell him it wasn't his fault, but I still couldn't speak clearly, and the drugs in my system were making everything feel distant and unreal. The lead paramedic told Kyle I'd been given a substantial dose of benzodiazepines mixed with something else they couldn't immediately identify, and we needed to get to the hospital fast because my respiratory rate was declining. Kyle asked if I would die, and the paramedic said not if they could help it, which wasn't the reassurance either of us needed to hear. The hospital was a blur of activity and tests and doctors asking questions while I drifted in and out of coherent thought. They pumped my stomach and gave me flumazenil to counteract the benzodiazepines, and slowly my brain started clearing enough to understand what people were saying. A detective named Laura Reeves came to interview me while I was still in the emergency room, and she had this calm but intense presence that made me feel like she actually cared about finding Daniel. I told her everything I could remember about the storage room conversation, and Monica's planned escape route, and the bassinet that was already set up. Detective Reeves wrote down every detail and then showed me Monica's phone records, which apparently showed multiple calls to burner phones over the past 2 months, and searches for how to forge birth certificates. She explained that Monica had been planning this for a while, probably since she'd learned about the baptism date, and had used her position as godmother to gain access and trust. Kyle sat in the chair next to my hospital bed with his head in his hands, and when he finally looked up, his eyes were red and devastated. He told me the police had found Monica's car abandoned at a rest stop 40 miles north with Daniel's car seat still installed but empty. She'd apparently switched vehicles, probably to a car she'd registered under a false name, and there was no trail to follow. The Amber Alert had gone out, but Monica had a significant head start and multiple planned stops, and every minute that passed meant she could be further away. Kyle broke down completely then, sobbing about how his sister had stolen our baby and might never be found. I wanted to comfort him, but I was still too weak and drugged to do much besides hold his hand and promise we'd find Daniel. Detective Reeves came back an hour later and said they'd issued warrants for Monica's arrest on charges of kidnapping, attempted murder, and child abduction, and the FBI was now involved because she'd likely crossed state lines. The toxicology reports came back showing I'd ingested a dangerous combination of lorazepam, diazepam, and a veterinary sedative called xylazine that Monica had apparently stolen from the animal clinic where her husband Glenn worked as a veterinarian. The doctor explained that the mixture should have killed me or at least caused permanent brain damage, and the only reason I survived was because I'd sipped the wine instead of drinking the full amount Monica had dosed. She'd put enough drugs in that communion chalice to kill 3 people, probably planning to make my death look like an accidental overdose after the baptism. The realization that Monica had been willing to murder me, not just sedate me, hit differently than the kidnapping. This wasn't just about taking Daniel. It was about erasing me entirely so she could step into my life. Detective Reeves told me they'd searched Monica's house and found detailed journals describing her obsession with my pregnancy and her deteriorating mental state as her own fertility treatments failed repeatedly. She'd written about watching me through windows and following me to doctor's appointments, documenting everything about my pregnancy and Daniel's routine. 3 days passed in the hospital with no sign of Monica or Daniel, and I felt myself coming apart at the seams. The physical effects of the drugs were wearing off, but the psychological damage was intensifying every hour my son was missing. Kyle barely left my room and neither of us slept, just stared at our phones hoping for updates from Detective Reeves or the FBI. My parents took turns sitting with us, bringing food nobody ate and offering reassurances nobody believed. On the 4th day, a different detective came to my room with news that made my heart stop. They'd tracked Monica to a small town in West Virginia, where she'd checked into a motel under her real name, apparently convinced she'd gotten away clean. Local police had surrounded the motel and negotiated for 2 hours before Monica finally came out with Daniel, who was unharmed and sleeping peacefully in her arms. She'd been arrested without incident, and Daniel was being transported back by FBI agents who were trained in infant care. I sobbed so hard I couldn't breathe, and Kyle collapsed against my hospital bed, both of us shaking with relief so intense it felt physical. The detective showed us photos on her phone of Daniel being examined by paramedics at the scene, completely healthy and showing no signs of distress or harm. Monica had apparently been caring for him properly with formula and diapers and gentle handling, playing the role of devoted mother even in her delusion. The FBI agents arrived at the hospital 8 hours later with Daniel, and when they placed him in my arms, I held him so carefully while checking every inch of his body for injuries or signs that anything was wrong. He looked up at me with those curious baby eyes and made his little cooing sounds, completely unaware of the nightmare he'd been through. Kyle wrapped his arms around both of us, and we stayed like that for a long time, crying and holding our son and thanking everyone who'd brought him back to us. Daniel was perfect and safe and home, but I knew I'd never feel completely secure again. Monica's preliminary hearing happened 2 weeks later, and I had to testify about what she'd said in that storage room before she took Daniel. Her lawyer tried to argue temporary insanity brought on by infertility trauma and depression, but the prosecutor presented all those journals and the premeditated planning and the multiple burner phones Monica had purchased months in advance. They showed the court her internet search history, including how to disappear with a child and how much sedative it takes to kill an adult woman and best states for faking birth certificates. The judge denied bail entirely, calling Monica a clear flight risk and danger to society, specifically to me and Daniel. Kyle testified against his own sister, describing how she'd manipulated the family and used her godmother role to gain access to hurt us. His parents sat in the courtroom looking destroyed, unable to reconcile their daughter's actions with the person they thought they knew. Glenn, Monica's husband, testified that he'd had no knowledge of her plans and had reported the missing veterinary sedatives thinking it was a theft, never suspecting his wife. The trial lasted 6 weeks, and every day brought new horrifying details about Monica's obsession and planning. Prosecutors showed the jury security footage from stores where Monica had purchased baby clothes in Daniel's size, a portable bassinet, fake identification supplies, and multiple prepaid credit cards. They presented testimony from Monica's therapist, who said she'd been treating Monica for infertility-related depression but had no idea how deep the obsession had become. The fertility clinic where Monica had undergone treatments testified that she'd stopped showing up for appointments 3 months before the baptism, probably when she'd decided taking Daniel was easier than continuing to try for her own baby. My testimony was the hardest, describing in detail how Monica had drugged me and admitted her plan while I was paralyzed and helpless. I had to recount the moment I realized she was taking my baby and I couldn't stop her, couldn't even call out or move. The jury watched me with these horrified expressions, and several were crying by the time I finished. The defense tried to paint Monica as a mentally ill woman broken by infertility trauma, presenting expert testimony about the psychological effects of repeated pregnancy loss and failed treatments. But the prosecution countered with evidence of Monica's calculated planning and her attempt to kill me, not just take Daniel. They argued that someone capable of meticulously plotting for months and dosing communion wine with lethal amounts of sedatives was not acting in a temporary fugue state, but making deliberate criminal choices. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and came back with guilty verdicts on all charges, including attempted murder, kidnapping, child abduction, and assault with a deadly weapon. Monica showed no emotion during the reading, just stared straight ahead with this blank expression. The judge scheduled sentencing for a month later and ordered psychiatric evaluation, though he noted the guilty verdicts meant the jury had rejected the insanity defense. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt hollow rather than triumphant, just exhausted from reliving the trauma repeatedly for 6 weeks. Sentencing day brought massive media attention because the case had become national news, the baptism kidnapping story that shocked everyone. The courtroom was packed with reporters and spectators, and I had to push through cameras just to get inside. The prosecutor requested maximum sentences given the premeditated nature of Monica's crimes and the profound trauma inflicted on our family. I read my victim impact statement describing how I still couldn't attend church services without having panic attacks, how I couldn't let Daniel out of my sight even to sleep, how I'd developed severe trust issues that destroyed friendships and made me suspicious of everyone. Kyle read his statement about the betrayal of having his own sister try to murder his wife and kidnap his child, and how his relationship with his parents had been permanently damaged by their initial attempts to defend Monica's actions as a mental health crisis. The judge listened to everything and then sentenced Monica to 25 years in prison with no possibility of parole for 15 years, calling it one of the most disturbing cases of obsessive criminal behavior she'd encountered in 30 years on the bench. Recovery was impossible in any traditional sense because there was no going back to who I'd been before Daniel's baptism turned into a crime scene. The physical effects faded over months, but the psychological damage ran deeper. I couldn't take communion at church services, couldn't drink anything I hadn't opened myself, couldn't trust anyone to hold Daniel except Kyle or my parents. I developed severe hypervigilance and intrusive thoughts about all the ways someone could hurt or take my baby, checking his crib 15 times a night to make sure he was still breathing. Therapy helped some, but mostly just gave me tools to manage the anxiety rather than eliminating it. Kyle struggled with his own guilt and family trauma, going no contact with his parents for a year because they kept trying to maintain a relationship with Monica through prison visits and letters. He eventually reconciled with them when they finally acknowledged the full scope of what Monica had done and stopped making excuses. Daniel grew up healthy and happy, unaware of the circumstances of his baptism. We never had him rebaptized because I couldn't face another ceremony, instead raising him with faith taught at home and in small community settings where I felt safe. When he turned 5, we moved to a different state for Kyle's job, but mostly to escape the constant recognition and news stories that resurfaced every time Monica had a parole hearing. We changed our last name legally to make it harder for people to connect us to the case, wanting Daniel to grow up without that shadow following him. I went back to school and became a trauma therapist specializing in violent crime victims, using my experience to help others navigate the impossible aftermath of betrayal by trusted people. My first client was a woman whose mother-in-law had tried to poison her, and I understood her fear and rage in ways textbooks never could have taught me. Monica sent a letter from prison when Daniel turned 7, asking for photos and updates on his life because she still considered herself his godmother. The return address made my hands shake so badly I dropped the envelope, and I burned it without reading past the first paragraph. She had no right to any part of Daniel's life, no right to know about his accomplishments or milestones or anything about the child she'd tried to steal. My therapist said that was a healthy boundary, and I shouldn't feel guilty about cutting off all contact with someone who'd nearly destroyed my family. Kyle agreed completely, and we both signed documents ensuring Monica would never have any legal claim to visitation rights or information about Daniel, even after her release from prison. His parents respected our decision after initially pushing for reconciliation, finally understanding that some betrayals can't be forgiven or forgotten just because time passes. Life moved forward in careful increments. Daniel started school and made friends and played soccer and had no idea his aunt was in prison for trying to murder his mother and kidnap him as a baby. Kyle and I rebuilt our marriage through intensive therapy, working through the trust issues and trauma responses that had nearly torn us apart in the first years after the baptism. We had a daughter 3 years after Daniel, and that pregnancy was terrifying in ways I couldn't fully articulate, convinced something would go wrong or someone would try to hurt us again. But she arrived healthy and perfect, and watching Kyle hold her in the hospital felt like proof we'd survived and could still create good things despite everything. I named her Grace because that felt appropriate, a reminder that sometimes you get unearned mercy in the form of second chances and healing you didn't think was possible. Monica became eligible for parole after serving 15 years, and the notification letter arrived when Daniel was 15 and Grace was 12. Both kids knew by then that their aunt had done something terrible when Daniel was a baby, but we'd protected them from the full details until they were old enough to process it. Daniel's reaction was quiet anger rather than shock, and Grace cried asking why someone would do that. We wrote statements opposing parole but didn't attend the hearing in person, not wanting to see Monica or give her any opportunity to try to connect with us. The parole board denied her release unanimously, citing the severity of her crimes and concerning statements she'd made during psychiatric evaluations about still believing she'd been entitled to take Daniel. She could reapply in 3 years, starting another cycle of mandatory notifications and required responses from victims, a permanent reminder that the justice system doesn't end when the trial does. Now, 19 years after that baptism, I run a nonprofit supporting families who've experienced kidnapping by relatives or close family friends, the cases that shatter trust in fundamental ways. Daniel is 20, studying criminal justice and planning to become a prosecutor like the woman who put Monica away. Grace is 17 and wants to be a trauma therapist, inspired by watching me turn our family's nightmare into purpose. Kyle works remotely now so he can be more present, having learned the hard way that missing important moments because you trust the wrong people creates regrets that last lifetimes. We still attend church as a family, but I never take communion, and Daniel understands why without me having to explain. The baptism photos sit in a locked box in our attic, never displayed or looked at, preserved evidence of the last minutes before everything changed. Monica serves the remainder of her sentence in a maximum security facility, and I hope she stays there for every day she's legally required to serve. My son's baptism turned into an attempted murder investigation in 30 minutes, but the recovery has taken 19 years and counting, teaching me that some wounds don't heal so much as become part of your foundation, shaping everything you build afterward. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too, so subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.